The term Soulslike is being thrown around constantly these days. A lot of people will just see a game with a dodge roll feature and melee combat and will instantly slap that Souls-like label on it. Of course, when you play a game that feels like a Souls game, you can tell. But it's really difficult to put into words all the different features that come together to make a game feel like a Souls game, and thus a Souls-like. So in this video, I'm going to put into words all the different features that come together to make a game feel like a Souls game. Naturally, the topic of this video is inherently subjective. The aspects of Souls games that give them their identity might be different according to each person that plays the games. Thus, each person might have their own intuitive list of what makes a game a true Souls-like. I'm going to try to be as impartial here as I can, but of course each person is entitled to their own opinion. That said, if you disagree with me, you suck and I hope you die. Before we start, I have a question to proclaim upon you. Do you think that Black Myth Wukong is a Souls-like, and why? Let me know down in the comments. Let's start off with discussing the term Souls-like. If you've been living under a rock, on Mars, and you don't know where this term comes from, then allow me to explain. Souls-like is a term that is used for games that are similar to FromSoftware's legendary game franchise Dark Souls and Demon Souls. Demon Souls was, of course, the first Souls game ever released. It's difficult to say though if the term Souls-like existed, or at least if it was widely used before Dark Souls 1 came along, since Dark Souls 1 is heralded as solidifying the standard FromSoftware formula that we all know and have a love-hate relationship with. Regardless, the term Souls-like refers to any games that are similar in design to the original Souls games, Demon Souls and the Dark Souls trilogy. Now, when Bloodborne was released in 2014, oh holy shit, that was 10 years ago, damn, the term Soulsborne was invented, referring to FromSoftware's line of games only, so Demon Souls, Dark Souls trilogy and Bloodborne. After that, Sekiro released in 2019, and Sekiro is a fairly different game than all of the previous Soulsborne games, so there was divide in the fandom as to whether or not it should be part of Soulsborne or not, or if there should be another term like Souls Sekiroborn. And of course after that, Elden Ring came along, and I shouldn't explain why it got pretty tedious trying to put all the names of the games in one word, so yeah, from now on I'm just going to be referring to the FromSoft games as FromSoft games. It's genius, I know. And when talking about FromSoft games that are either Souls or their spiritual successors, I'm not including Sekiro into that list, and you'll see why later on. So, to figure out what makes a Souls-like, first we have to see the characteristics that make FromSoft games what they are. There are a lot of design aspects and characteristics that make up the FromSoft games, so to make this video a little bit easier to digest, I've broken them down into 4 main categories: overall game design, combat and enemy design, character design, and world and level design. Let's quickly go over the general game stuff first, as they're the easiest. First up is the camera. Wait, the camera? That should have been in enemy design, am I right, fellas? The camera is in third-person view from the back, which is less of a design choice and more of a design necessity. I mean, what else would it have been? First person? You'd need to play this game with a bucket next to you. I mean, it could have been top-down view, but that just sounds weird. If it's a 3D game, then it's third person from the back, no questions asked. The music, or lack thereof, is an extremely important and iconic aspect of FromSoft games. Ambient music is actually fairly rare in FromSoft games aside from Elden Ring. This facilitates a feeling of immersion and loneliness. Furthermore, the fact that ambient music is scarce makes it possible to highlight specific areas of importance by including it. For example, in Dark Souls 1, there were only 4 places in the game with background music: the Firelink Shrine, the Doors of Chaos, Guinevere's Chambers, and the Ash Lake. All important locations in terms of lore. And of course, we can't forget the boss soundtracks. The best music in the FromSoft games is saved exclusively for the bosses. With each major boss usually having their own theme that encapsulates their essence. This lets you know that the bosses are a big deal. It's a part of the game that FromSoft goes out of their way to highlight. It's like they're telling you, this is why you're playing the game. The UI or user interface in FromSoft games is minimalistic. There are no maps, besides in Elden Ring of course, and no fluff in the UI. You have your health bar, your stamina bar, your FP bar, your equipped gear, and your consumables or items to use. There are no markers guiding you to quests, no clear waypoints that show you where you're supposed to go. Elden Ring did streamline a lot of these things, to be honest, adding a map and a compass feature in the UI, but even then, FromSoftware prefers a minimalist approach. You can add markers and waypoints in the maps, sometimes NPCs will mark certain areas for you, and you can see some locations in the actual map, but again, there are no official markers or information like that found in other open world games, like modern Assassin's Creed games for example. Quests don't exist in the conventional sense. NPC quests do exist, but you actually have to pay attention to what they're saying, and a lot of the times they speak in riddles or use cryptic language. There's no quest log to follow, no checkmarks to see if you've missed anything, and no standardized reward system. Quests are cryptic in nature. Sometimes different NPC quests will intertwine with each other, sometimes you'll have to pick sides, and most of the times the NPC in question will die at the end of the questline, either by you or by something else. And of course, one of the most iconic features of FromSoftware games, or lack of features, is the lack of difficulty options. There are always heated discussions about this topic, and I do plan to make a video about it, so I won't linger here for too long. But to be brief, no, difficulty options do not work and should not exist on FromSoftware games. The games are designed around their difficulty, it is an integral part of the game. Giving players the ability to tamper with that difficulty through some option on the menu would go against the core aspects that FromSoftware games want to highlight. So to recap, general game design aspects that give FromSoft games their identity are a third-person view from the back, a lack or sparse use of ambient music and memorable boss soundtracks, a minimalistic approach to the user interface, cryptic quest lines and the absence of a quest log, and a lack of difficulty options. Now let's get into arguably the most important category, the combat and enemies. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's focus on the combat first. There is one aspect of FromSoft games that gives them their identity more so than pretty much anything and everything else. Dodge rolling is obviously a staple in FromSoft games and has become so synonymous with the franchise that some people will literally just see a dodge roll and claim that a game is a Soulslike based on that alone. Of course, dodging or even roll dodging is nothing new, nor is it exclusive to FromSoft games. Almost every single action RPG out there has a dodge mechanic, some of which involve rolling. Dodge rolling wasn't even introduced in Demon's Souls. Hell, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time featured a roll. Where FromSoft games stand out, however, is how dodging works as well as how pivotal it is to the combat. You can think of dodging as having two types. The first is to simply get you out of the way of an incoming attack. It is used as a movement option. The second, and the one that FromSoft games implement, is to nullify damage as well as move to a favorable position. So besides a movement option, it is also a defensive option. Now, iframes or invincibility frames in dodging are also nothing new. They were used way back in the day of old school 2D action games, but FromSoft games stand out as to how critical and central dodging is in those games. You can think of these games as dodge-centric. Of course, you have other means to protect yourself, such as correct positioning, blocking, and parrying, but even then, dodging is still an incredibly important part of gameplay, and not just a novelty option used sparingly. Even in the slower games like Dark Souls 1 and 2, where dodging isn't as good as the recent games, it is still the bread and butter of combat. Think about how much different the FromSoft games would be if dodging didn't have iframes and was only used as a means to move out of the way. Most bosses would not even be able to function as they are if that was the case, and their attacks would need to be redesigned. So, dodge rolling, an extremely important part of the identity of FromSoft games. Another critical part of FromSoft games that often gets overlooked is stamina management. Stamina is undoubtedly the most important core stat that gives the FromSoft games their identity. I mean, health is whatever, almost all games feature a health bar. The FP bar is again standard for any game that features a magic or special attack system, but stamina is what governs the flow of the fight. In FromSoft games, almost everything costs stamina. From running to dodging to attacking to using spells. Any sort of important movement aside from walking will drain your stamina in combat. Thus, FromSoftware combat is also stamina-centric. All Souls players learn how to manage stamina, how many attacks they can get away with while still having enough stamina to get out of trouble, how fast stamina regenerates. If I completely exhaust my stamina punishing a boss, is my regeneration fast enough that I can dodge before I get hit by an attack, or do I play it safe? So a rechargeable stamina bar or something that represents it, that governs the flow of combat, is another incredibly important design of FromSoft games. Speaking of the flow of combat, something that defines combat in FromSoft games is how grounded it is and how heavy the attacks feel. Partly due to the stamina management aspect and partly due to just design choices, your character in FromSoft games is very slow and very grounded. which is what sets it apart from other action RPGs like Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, or even Black Myth Wukong. In FromSoft games, an attack, even a light attack, has meaning behind it. You found an opportunity in between the boss's attacks to retaliate. You're never there just tapping the R1 button until something dies. Your character doesn't jump around doing flashy moves or ultimate attacks. Now obviously in Elden Ring you can jump, but it's just a single jump plus maybe a jump attack. The combat is simple, grounded, and strategic. Your character is the opposite of flashy is what I'm saying. Now the bosses themselves can have flashy moves, especially in Elden Ring, but you deal with these moves with your trusted toolset of dodging, blocking, and determination. Now let's talk about the difficulty. FromSoftware games are difficult, yes.
I know, I got it. I got the concept.
But I want to focus on where that difficulty stems from, specifically when talking about the boss battles. Difficulty in an action game can come from two sources. One, the game's own internal combat system, meaning there are techniques to master or strategies to learn. And two, external difficulty coming from the enemies or the environment, so having to master each boss's individual patterns to beat it. The combat in FromSoftware games is very simple to learn. Now, it has a skill ceiling, yes, but the combat itself is very simple and intuitive. You run, you dodge, you attack, maybe block or parry if you're feeling saucy, but the basic toolset is there for everyone. Difficulty in FromSoft games comes almost exclusively from the enemies and the environment. A boss in a FromSoftware game is difficult not because you need to learn how to properly dodge or attack, but because you need to learn when to dodge and attack at this particular boss fight. I don't think there's such a thing as mastering Souls combat. Don't master the combat in general, you master the fights. When our Lord and Savior Miyazaki releases his new spiritual successor to Elden Ring and the Soulsborne games, yes, being a veteran will give you an advantage for sure, but you're still going to die at least a few times to a lot of bosses. Why? Because that's where the difficulty comes from, learning and adapting to the enemy's attacks. So, having challenging bosses and enemies that you have to learn how to beat, while at the same time having intuitive and easy to get into combat, is another core aspect of the FromSoft game's identity. Speaking about the bosses, they are the highlights of FromSoft games. Like I mentioned earlier, the music in the game is usually reserved for boss fights. Boss fights need to exist and they need to be a highlight of the game if it's going to be considered a Souls-like. The number of bosses the game has, however, doesn't need to fit into a specific number. After all, FromSoft games can vary widely when it comes to the number of bosses they have. Elden Ring features 238 bosses in the base game, though as I mentioned in my previous video, most of these bosses are either repeating bosses or normal enemy variants, usually found at the end of small dungeons. Regardless, you can find the boss at basically every corner in Elden Ring. Dark Souls 3 on the flip side only has 19 bosses in the base game, going for quality over quantity. So while bosses do need to be highlighted and be unique in order for the game to classify as Souls-like, the number of bosses shouldn't matter in the inclusion criteria in my opinion. So to recap, as far as the combat and enemy system goes, the identity of FromSoft games comes from a dodge-focused combat in which the dodge provides invincibility frames and is used constantly, a stamina-centric combat that features a rechargeable stamina bar, grounded combat and a character that is relatively slow with each attack feeling like it matters, and a lack of overly flashy moves. Bosses being highlights of the game, an intuitive combat system with difficulty stemming from the need to learn each individual boss's and even enemies' patterns and adapt accordingly. Let's move on to character design. FromSoftware games are classified as action RPGs, the RPG label meaning that the games offer liberty and freedom as to what character the player can create. One aspect of all FromSoftware games that is not shared by Sekiro is that they don't feature existing main characters. You, the player, have to create your own character and customize them however you want. Interestingly, not many action games or even action RPGs do this. Most games that at least I personally played have you controlling a preset main character, like The Witcher 3, God of War, or Black Myth Wukong. You can customize these characters to an extent, sure, but they are still existing characters. More importantly though, is the way leveling works in FromSoftware games. FromSoft games feature traditional levels. However, they forego the standard formula of leveling up through XP and have opted for the main currency to be used as a means to level up. Souls, Blood Echoes, Runes, you are effectively buying levels, with each level costing more than the previous one. I'm not sure if Demon's Souls was the first game that introduced this mechanic, or if it existed in the past, but the FromSoftware games have certainly pushed it into the mainstream. This feature sets up an interesting and unique approach to gameplay, since the main currency of the game is also used for everything else, like buying items or gear or upgrading weapons. You have to choose how you spend your currency wisely. Each level you buy corresponds to one stat. FromSoft games typically have a stat each for the 3 core stats, 2 melee-based stats, 2 magic-based stats, some sort of equip load stat, and maybe a stat that governs loot drops or other mechanics like the luck or arcane stats. Of course, we can't talk about currency in FromSoftware games without mentioning everybody's favorite death penalty system. In FromSoftware games, you drop your currency when you die. You have one chance to pick up your hard-earned money from when you last died, but if you die again without managing to collect it, it's gone for good. Losing your currency is an absolute staple in FromSoft games. It forces you to think twice before haphazardly rushing into a new area or a boss fight. You'll always get situations where you're just a few runes short of a level up, and you're pondering whether to risk it and go into that boss fight or play it safe and go farm some mobs for the extra cash. Something that is staple in FromSoft games is the flexibility of allocating your levels. You will only earn so many levels in the game, but the game itself doesn't restrict you when it comes to where you can allocate them, even though the game does feature starting classes. But classes only dictate your starting stats, not necessarily how these stats will end up, meaning that you can, theoretically, start with a sorcerer and end up as a strength monkey build. It's not recommended, but it's possible. Stat redistribution also exists in the game, though for a price. Let's also talk about gear. Something that again sets FromSoft games apart from other action RPGs is the fact that you have tons of weapon types to choose from. Not just weapons, but weapon types. The combat in FromSoftware games is melee-centric, meaning that the game expects you to be up close and personal with the enemies. Of course, ranged options do exist, like magic using items and bows, and guns in the case of Bloodborne, but the games are primarily focused on melee combat, though the games don't restrict you to one main weapon like other games, like Sekiro or Wukong for example. You can use swords, greatswords, fists, perfumes, you name it. Weapons always have stat requirements as well as stat scaling. If you don't meet the requirements, then you're unable to use the weapon effectively. Scaling dictates how much more powerful the weapon becomes when you level the corresponding stat. The higher the scaling, the higher the benefit. Upgrading a weapon can sometimes increase one or more of its stat scaling numbers. So, to recap, character design in FromSoft games is defined by having the player create a character instead of having them control an existing one, featuring starting classes but enabling full freedom when it comes to stat allocation when leveling, having a traditional leveling system instead of an ability system, using a leveling system that is currency dependent, thus making currency the lifeblood of the games, having death penalties in which you drop your currency when you die and then lose it permanently if you don't manage to pick it up before you die again, and having a variety of weapon types, mostly melee but ranged options as well, that feature stat requirements and stat scaling. And finally, let's talk about world and level design. The worlds of FromSoft games are deliberately created in order to feel empty. Not empty in the sense that there's nothing to do, empty in the sense that you feel alone in a dark and mysterious place. NPCs do exist, of course, but they are rare and usually don't have too many things to say to you. The worlds of FromSoftware games are always bleak and hostile, even if they sometimes feature bright colors. They project despair but always subtly inspire hope through some NPCs and of course you, the player character. FromSoftware typically features linear-ish level design. I say linear-ish and not linear since most levels feature branching paths and opportunities to steer away from the quote-unquote main path. Most levels feature shortcuts, which are another staple of FromSoftware games. Even though Elden Ring is an open-world game, the most important bosses are still found in legacy dungeons, which do follow the standard linear-ish level design of previous FromSoftware titles. Up next for the level design aspect we have checkpoints, another iconic feature that is almost synonymous with FromSoftware games. Whether they are called bonfires, lamps, or sites of grace, these checkpoints serve a critical role in the Souls experience. Other than acting as actual checkpoints in the progression of a level, they will completely heal your character, refill your healing items, sometimes act as places for you to level up, as well as strengthen or repair your weapons, and of course, act as fast travel points. They will also respawn any non-boss and non-special enemies. And lastly, for the level design, we have the hub areas. areas like the Firelink Shrine, Majula, the Hunter's Dream, and the Round Table Hall. These areas contain many important NPCs like quest givers, smiths, merchants, and of course, each game's waifu that is responsible for leveling up your character, though she doesn't actually appear in the hub area in Elden Ring. Sometimes these hub areas can be traversed through physically in the game, like in the Dark Souls trilogy, while other times they exist in a separate instance and have to be fast traveled to, like in Demon Souls, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring. So, world building and level design features that give FromSoftware games their identity are empty feeling, hostile worlds that sparsely feature NPCs or anything that is non-hostile to the player, linear-ish level design with branching paths and the use of shortcuts, checkpoints that respawn non-boss and non-special enemies, refill your usable healing items and act as fast travel points, and a hub area with many important NPCs. Whew! Alright, so we have a total of 20 different design aspects that, in my opinion, give FromSoftware games their identity. For a game to classify as a Souls-like, it must include some, if not most, of these aspects. Now, as I said in the beginning of the video, each person is going to have a different opinion as to which aspects are the most important for a game to be considered a Souls-like and which are optional. Maybe for one person, a hostile, empty-feeling world might be at the top of their list. For another, it might be the currency-dependent leveling system. So I'm going to give you my own list, and of course let me know yours down in the comments. I've broken down the game aspects into 3 tiers. The first one is mandatory, meaning the game has to feature these aspects if it's going to be considered a Souls-like. The second one is important, meaning the game has to have at least some of these features plus the mandatory features if it's going to be considered a Souls-like. And the third one is optional. The game can include these features to give it more of a Souls-like feel, but not including them doesn't affect the outcome that much. So for me, the mandatory design aspects are: first of all the combat and enemy design aspects that we mentioned. So a dodge-focused combat in which the dodge provides iframes and the use of the time, stamina-centric combat, grounded, more methodical combat, any character that is relatively slow, bosses being highlights of the game, and an intuitive combat system with difficulty stemming from the need to learn each individual boss's attacks. And aside from these, we also have a few more. The third-person view from the back, obviously, a lack of difficulty options, a linear-ish level design, and a checkpoint system. Now, this doesn't mean that any game with these features is automatically a Souls-like in my book. It just means that any game that is going to be considered a Souls-like needs to feature these aspects at the very least. Now, for the important but not mandatory aspects, we have a minimalistic user interface, cryptic quest lines and the absence of a quest log, player-created characters instead of existing ones, freedom on stat allocation, a traditional leveling system with stats and not abilities, a currency-dependent leveling system, death penalty, and empty-feeling hostile worlds. All of these aspects are important for me and serve a role in the overall Souls experience. However, the absence of one or two wouldn't automatically mean that a game would be disqualified as a Souls-like in my books, so long as it met the mandatory criteria and many of the other important criteria. And lastly, for the optional aspects, we have all the ones that remained. A lack of ambient music and memorable boss soundtracks, though you could say that memorable boss soundtracks are included in the bosses being highlights aspect, so we're mostly talking about the lack of ambient music here, a variety of weapon types, and a hub area. I have no issue with classifying a game as a Souls-like even if it only features one specific weapon type, so long as that weapon type doesn't go against the overall FromSoftware flow of combat. Hub areas are nice for Souls games, yes, but I wouldn't mind classifying a game as a Souls-like even if it didn't include one, and rather scattered all the NPCs in the open world and used the checkpoints as a means to level up. Now, armed with this knowledge, let's take a look at 3 separate games and decide if they can be considered Souls-likes. The first is Sekiro, a game made from FromSoftware themselves. Is Sekiro a Souls-like? In my opinion, no. Sekiro doesn't meet one of my mandatory inclusion criteria, which is a dodge-focused combat. Now, there is a dodge, but it's not nearly as important as the parry. In Sekiro, the parry is your primary means of avoiding damage. The dodge is secondary and is not even nearly as good as other FromSoftware titles. Dodging is mostly used to get out of the way of an incoming attack that can't be parried, rather than as a brief window of invincibility. Sekiro also doesn't meet some of the important criteria. It features an existing character rather than having the player create one, it doesn't feature a traditional leveling system with stats, opting for an ability system instead, the leveling is not currency dependent and is instead XP dependent, and doesn't actually feature classes. Overall, Sekiro is fairly different from the Souls games, and that is 100% intentional. It's very clear that FromSoftware wanted to try out new things and to go in a little bit of a different direction with Sekiro. And it absolutely worked. Sekiro is an amazing game and you should definitely give it a try if you haven't already. Another game I want to talk about is Lies of P. Is Lies of P a Souls-like? Absolutely. First of all, it meets all of the mandatory inclusion criteria, every single one of them. Dodge-centric and stamina-centric combat? Check. Though the dodge might not be as good as FromSoftware games, it's still integral to the game. Grounded, slower, more methodical combat? Check. Bosses being highlights of the games and the player having to learn their individual patterns to beat them? Check. Lack of difficulty options, linear-ish level design, a checkpoint system, and of course, the standard third-person view from the back? Lies of P has you covered. Second, it actually meets almost all of the important criteria except for one, a player-created character. You instead play as an existing main character. Now that doesn't mean that the game can't have its own unique mechanics and features. The blade and handle system, for example, isn't something that exists in FromSoftware games, but that doesn't disqualify Lies of P from being a Souls-like. It's a Souls-like, not a Souls clone. And lastly, let's talk about a more recent one, Black Myth Wukong. Is Black Myth Wukong a Souls-like? Well, in my opinion, it is not. The biggest reason why is because the combat in Black Myth Wukong feels substantially different from that in FromSoftware games. It is dodge and stamina centric, yes, but it feels much more flashy and fast-paced than that in FromSoftware titles. When you perform a perfect dodge, you have a brief window to punish your enemies. You can immobilize most enemies and beat them up. Combat feels like a mix between the slower, more methodical combat of FromSoftware titles and the faster-paced, flashier combat of games like Devil May Cry. Black Myth Wukong also doesn't meet a lot of the important criteria. It features an existing character instead of having the player create one. It has an ability system instead of a traditional leveling system. The leveling system is XP dependent and not currency dependent, and there is no death penalty. In this sense, it's closer to Sekiro than it is to Souls games, but even then it's not really that similar to Sekiro. Black Myth Wukong is definitely its own thing and that is absolutely fine. In my opinion, when true Souls-like get released, you can actually tell that the developers are trying to make them resemble Souls games as much as possible, like in the case of Lies of P, for example. Which brings me to my final point. The term Souls-like is inherently problematic because it forces a black and white situation. A game is either a Souls-like or it isn't.
You're either perfect or you're not me. There's no gray area.
Which doesn't actually make sense. Lots of games can be inspired by Souls games, but their level of similarity to them can vary a lot. So a metric like Souls proximity, for example, would be far more practical, with the actual Souls games being the 10, and then everything else would be ranked in terms of how similar they are to them. Anyway, thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more Souls and general game content, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.